we can keep working to figure out how we can finally retire coal, which has built our country, but it's not the energy source we need for the 21st century.
Well, America doesn't even have an energy plan, and neither does the world. So without a plan, it's pretty hard to reach the goal.
Welcome Sally Ranney, my partner from the old days of AREDAY, and now she's going to have a dialogue with Mr. Brinkley on how we can move forward into the future with environmentalism in our presidents, we hope. Thanks.
So my first question is, how and why did you become so interested in presidential history?
Well, Sally, I grew up in Georgia and Ohio, but my parents were teachers, and we had a coachman trailer. And so I had that privilege of going around the country and camping all over. And it's even today, my parents have died. My dad died this year in '94. But the memories I had of being in all those great places, I had the opportunity to, camp in the Great Smokies or visit the Everglades, et cetera. And it really stuck with me. And then when I had kids, I realized I had always liked presidents. In Ohio, we call our state the mother of presidents. Not many good ones from there, but numerically we had a lot. And we had Grant born in Ohio. Rutherford B. Hayes' home was just down a country road from me. So I decided to tie my interest in presidents to my interest in the parks or conservation. And I began it with my book, The Wilderness Warrior, on TR. And now I've marched through TR, FDR in this book, which is Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. And I'm hoping to continue doing work where Jimmy Carter would be a big figure in my horizon.
Great. Yeah. Jimmy Carter is, he has quite a legacy. And I was very lucky to work very closely with him on the Alaska Lands Bill. And I do have some questions about him, but...
Can I ask you, what would tell me about Alaska lands?
Well, it was the Alaska Lands Conservation Act, ANILCA, and this was in the 70s. So we started looking at Alaska in about 1970, actually, in the Audubon office of then a Audubon senior policy analyst, Brock Evans, and we started drawing boundaries around the various areas that we knew really needed to be protected. And eventually put this legislation together. It was a tough fight, It was a tough fight and a long fight, but eventually 101 million acres we were able to protect. And those were in wildlife refuges and preserves, which was kind of a nuance. Because in refuges you can't hunt, in preserves you can. And of course the subsistence hunting was very much on the forefront then. Wilderness areas, wild and scenic rivers, etc. And literally in the last days of his presidency, Carter signed this bill, and it was a huge celebration around the country. Because we had a lot of opposition from a lot of different sectors, but we included everybody.
Well, I have to include you in my next book. Tell your story. I'm serious. And Carter also did the Department of Energy. He also did Superfund sites, designating toxic fills. And he's a real outdoors person. And his book, The Outdoor Journal, is worth reading. Now that Carter's 99 and we're pulling for him to hit 100, he would love it if you all read, in honor of him, the Outdoor Journal. It's really good writing, and he modeled it after William O. Douglas's books called My Wilderness.
Yes, and you mentioned Supreme Court Justice Douglas, and he really is the one that I think started people thinking about the rights of nature, because he wrote a thesis on do trees have standing, basically in court. I was lucky to know him and his wife as well, and he was really remarkable.
I would have done anything. I've gotten to know Kathy, but I didn't know Bill Douglas. One of my great regrets, he is a phenomenal what he did, because pre-EPA, there was no regulatory world. You know,
Right.
there wasn't Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, all the rest of the Great Society years. There was nothing, but Bill Douglas used his office as a clearinghouse. So if you here in Boulder had an issue with water contamination, you can go send it to Douglas, and he would read all this stuff from grassroots groups. And if you wrote him a postcard even, or send him pictures of your problem, he'd fly in, and he'd say, give me a lift there, and I'll do whatever you need me to do to get behind your cause. So we still haven't caught up with him, and as you rightfully say, he believed that there was a Wilderness Bill of Rights, which translates as that we should have in the Bill of Rights a right to clean air and clean water, and that nobody should be able to have to be living within a toxic or contaminated environment, and that trees have standing, and that companies would have to pay. Like, even if there was a oil spill, let's say in the Gulf of Mexico, and if I bought a house by Corpus Christi because I wanted to watch the whooping cranes migrate, I'm a birder, and if the BP spill destroyed that area and damaged the wildlife, the company would owe me money for my home at what it was pre-spill. So he was doing a lot of things that were environmental incentives. And really, I've interviewed now all the early 60s, the ones that are left, of the big early wave of environmental lawyers, and they all point to Bill Douglas's inspiration.
Yes, that's right. And I wanted to bring up a couple people that you didn't mention. One is Gaylord Nelson, who was also very influential with President Kennedy around, in general, protecting the environment. And I think that he had sway there from what I've read. Another person is Edward Zonheiser, who actually was one of the key authors of the Wilderness Act, which passed in 1964. Tell us a little bit about him.
Two giants, and that I write about them in my book. Gaylord Nelson, I would say, was the #1 environmental senator, period. He was from Wisconsin. He is the one who I mentioned, the Apostle Islands, that fought for that, but so much more. And Wisconsin was interesting because, John Muir grew up there, and then Aldo Leopold of the Sand County Almanac's from there. And Nelson fell really into land preservation, and as you rightfully say, he convinced Kennedy to do a conservation tour around the country, and he was the one pushing, and the big thing was, after that Cuyahoga River spill in the summer of '69, Vietnam War protests were erupting. Gaylord was on a plane going to Seattle or coming back from Seattle, I don't remember which right now. But he, on that plane, had the idea of Earth Day, a teaching about ecology, not the war. And out of that, it just started snowballing. And an interesting thing I discovered, Sally, was, so Nelson's pushing Earth Day. The first one is April 22nd, 1970. Well, Nixon is paranoid about Earth Day. Really, he thinks it's, in one document I saw, a pinko commie plot to embarrass me. And even though he was doing all this stuff, he saw this massive people getting together. It's going to turn into an anti-Nixon rally. The idea of it spurred him to do a lot of things, Nixon, the Earth Day. But when they finally got Nixon had one very clever thing. He put FBI and others, beyond bugging people with surveillance that were environmentalists. He wanted to know who's paying for these Earth Day offices. They're sprouting up everywhere. Yeah. And he got an answer, and it was really almost exclusively one person, Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers. And his plane crashed a couple days after the first Earth Day, Walter and May Reuther. But Walter Reuther was pushing in the Green Alliance and Labor, which we're trying to see that happen now with electric vehicles or in Detroit, and we're in a strike zone, you know. But Reuther shouldn't be forgotten in that conservation world, because his view was working people in a factory don't have time to go to Yellowstone or Alaska. They have to have a clean pond. They should be able to fish in their backyard. They should have outdoor recreation. So he was thinking more of what today environmental justice people are doing, of how do you take poor neighborhoods and green it and have, you know, regenerative farming maybe in the area to bring food and all that. And then Sennheiser, as he mentioned, was really incredible lobbyist for wilderness, brilliant writer, thinker, definitely in the Thoreau, Mary Austin kind of tradition. And he died right before the Wilderness Act passed. But Johnson had, rightfully so, had his widow, and also Marty Murray, Olaus Murray's wife there, for that signing ceremony of the Wilderness Act. And those are just two of the many important heroes. What I've been trying to make sure we remember them. Everybody here is doing stuff much more cutting edge and important for our lives today, but I'm trying to make sure that I remember the people in the past, and maybe we can learn things. The big thing I learned from Brower, which it sounds like the most throwaway line I could say, and he'd say, "Have fun saving the planet." And he kept saying it over and over again. He says, "Have fun saving." And what he meant, and I read it more, is just like when you see young people today really concerned about climate, and they have climate angst and anxiety, and they're looking at this and he's saying, or get together, order some pizza, come up with a plan, have some fun, make it fun, be joyful while you're working to do your environment. Don't make it drudgery or be angst-ridden. Life's too special for that. And I think it's a healthy message as we're trying to get college kids more engaged. As Woody Guthrie used to say, kids need to be hope machines. And, you want them to be hopeful, not just doomsday.
Right, exactly. And also David Brower, in part, because I also knew him and worked with him, he was telling himself that as much as he was telling everyone else, because he was haunted by some dam proposals that he wasn't able to stop, and some other issues. But he was brilliant. If you don't know, he took the Sierra Club from 2,000 to 77,000 members, and had, they thought that he was too controversial. He was very hardcore environmentalist, and he would draw the line, and he would not go over that line, no matter what. So he eventually left the Sierra Club, and he started Earth Island Institute. He started Earth First, a couple other organizations, and he really was a force to deal with.
And I noticed do any of you guys remember Ron Dellums, the congressman from Oakland, was very involved with, a Black Power movement in many ways. He was nominating Brower every year to win the Nobel Prize. He thought the work that Brower was doing on the environment was that consequential. So I learned a lot when you study Brower as how to organize. He was a genius. And the calendars and posters of the 60s, and he used Ansel Adams photos as, as starter points, and he was tireless going to schools. He would be university after university. And I should say in the 60s, Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, I interviewed Dolores Huerta on stage for Ms. Magazine, Miz's 50th birthday, and her work with Gloria Steinem. But Dolores Huerta and Chavez were the ones out in the San Joaquin Valley and all talking about pesticides and how poisonous these chemicals were to people, and they were deforming babies. And they're really environmental justice warrior. I mean, 62 is Rachel Carson, but by 64, 65, and 66, the United Farm Workers are ringing the same the same warning note.
Well, and it was Johnson, President Johnson, actually, that passed the first, well, it wasn't anti-pesticides, but controlling pesticides. And now, the review of the chemicals that are on the market, about 2/3 of those that are on the market have never been reviewed yet. Just so you know that, read your labels.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's a gigantic point. DDT only got banned in North America. It's still exported to Africa and places. Another name we could throw in there while we're going down memory lane, Barry Commoner. And he early in the 50s got very involved with the problems with DDT and pesticides. But it was a Republican, a rather conservative, very honest Indiana Republican, William Ruckelshaus, who was first head of the EPA for Nixon. And Ruckelshaus said, look, we're going to solve the DDT thing once for all. I want to see all the data. I want to look at the scientific information. Nixon didn't want it banned because it was angering ranchers and some of his constituents big time. But Ruckelshaus said it's killing the eagles, it's killing the birds, it's going to kill humans, and he banned it and stood by his guns. And I learned to really admire Ruckelshaus being able, and I try in my research when there's a leading, now so many environmental movement often are Democrats, but when a Republican steps up and does something like Ruckelshaus did, you have to pay notice. I even have been kind to John Ehrlichman, who went to jail for Watergate. But Ehrlichman was a land water lawyer out of Seattle, and thank God he was around the White House because Nixon told him, you figure all this stuff out. There wouldn't have been an EPA without Ehrlichman working with Scoop Jackson of Washington or Dingell in Michigan because Ehrlichman wanted it, and he was able to convince Nixon to sign it. So you never know who can help the cause, and don't judge everybody too quickly by what you hear about them.
I'm also interested in the women behind some of these men. Tell us a little bit about Gifford Pinchot, who obviously influenced Teddy Roosevelt and the National Forest Reserves. They were actually for multiple use. And she was the committee chair for the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution. She was the Conservation Committee chair. And she had a lot of influence on him, did she not?
Massive influence on him, and she's somebody that should be talked about more. The Rockefeller family did a lot with conservation, but on the women front, I've written about, I mentioned some today, but Rosalie Edge, who was starting to do hawk protection in her hawk sanctuary. I don't want to eat our clock up, so I'll try to jam this little story in quickly. But during Pearl Harbor happened, and the Mountain Division of our ski troopers, 10th Mountain Division, were in a place called Henry's Lake, Idaho, near Yellowstone. And this is where they were doing demolition, blowing up things, firing things. It was, to train to go to the Alps in World War II. And he gets a letter, Roosevelt, from Rosalie Edge, a socialist environmentalist, saying, dear Mr. President, Henry's Lake is disturbing the trumpeters' swans. They winter there because it doesn't freeze over, and they're going to go extinct, the trumpeters, if they don't move. 10th Mountain Division. We had just paid $25 million, which was a lot of money back then, to build this big training center. Roosevelt writes, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, I've looked into the fight between the trumpeters and the U.S. Army, and you lose. The U.S. Army must denest. Franklin Roosevelt, and they moved to Camp Hale, Colorado. And David Brower was a ski trooper for the 10th Mountain Division going over there. Why in the world would FDR do such a thing? because he knew you couldn't gouge, that people were going to want to say, for the war effort, we got to cut into all the reserves, cut the timber, we got to do anything. And he was arguing that we saved this for democracy, that our parks and all are part of the American spirit, that we're not here to lose them, and that we can do both. That's leadership. That's very hard to find in politics.
Today, particularly. Yes. And what about Celia Hunter?
Celia Hunter was an extraordinary Alaska conservationist. She was a bush pilot up in Alaska, and it's very tied to the whole history of women in aviation up there in big ways. But she started organizing Alaska conservation leagues, and really the progenitor of why Alaska hasn't been ruined emanates directly from her and her conservation work. I did get a chance to know her and interviewed her. I did a book called The Quiet World, Saving Alaska's Wilderness Kingdom, from the time Muir went up there to Hunter, and she's remarkable, and I learned so much from her.
Yes, yeah, she was the first woman to be an executive director of a major conservation organization, and that was the Wilderness Society. And she influenced President Carter in moving that legislation, and she pushed everyone to get it done before he went out of office, because it would have never, ever happened.
Absolutely. And while we're thinking, but I know we're dealing now a lot of issues of race in our country and trying to rectify certain things. And I'll tell you, the civil rights movement of Dr. King is very much part of the environmental movement. People don't realize that Dr. Coretta Scott King was really a leader of the stopping of the nuclear testing movement, SANE. And she would protest, go to Geneva to stop nuclear testing in Nevada and underground, actually, here in Colorado. But from 1946 to 1991, we detonated 1,054 nuclear weapons in the United States. And Kennedy did the great thing of banning signing the nuclear test ban treaty, and Coretta Scott King was one of the spurs of that, and also a group called Women Strike for Peace. And the net effect was Kennedy got Khrushchev and Russia and Britain to sign no nuclear testing in the atmosphere or underwater. It's an epic achievement. Kennedy deserved huge credit for that. I just am reading that Putin's threatening to undo that treaty and use nuclear weapons testing back in Siberia. And so we all have to keep an eye on that. But Dr. King, Dr. King said, what good does it do to integrate a lunch counter if the milk you're drinking has strontium-90 in it from the fallout? And Andy Young told me, Dr. King's associate, the whole Montgomery bus boycott, the point of not being in the back of the bus wasn't just the indignity of it. That's where the diesel, those are unair-conditioned buses in Alabama and the heat, and the diesel fumes would hit you in the back, and your eyes would burn, and you'd be sick. And so in many ways, the bus boycott has an environmental edge to it. And John Lewis, who we all associate with the vote, starting really in 1980s, was the great leader of environmental justice movement starting with the PCB's battle in Warren County, North Carolina and beyond, and Lewis is another great environmental hero. So they're not separate, the human rights, civil rights, environmental, there's a lot of overlap that I'm looking at in history.
Well, the social movements, when you look at the social movements, Martin Luther King and civil rights, the environmental movement, the climate movement, the women's movement, the movement for votes, they're started because there is so much discontent that if one leader surfaces, others will follow. And it's those movements that have really shifted history over the long period of time. The study of social movements is really actually quite fascinating because it really, they really have directed history. And that's why, and I want to jump here because we're running out of time, that's why the climate movement, if you study movements and you look at the climate movement, it's much more fragmented than these other movements were. And that is part, in my opinion, part of the reason, and also messaging, part of the reason why it's taken as long as it has. But they say it usually takes 20 to 45 years to make social change. So we're in that we're in that loop. I want to ask you, there's another woman who, going back to nuclear testing, Winona LaDuke, a Native American, lives in the Dakotas, and she stopped nuclear testing in the Black Hills, and she's done a lot of other things since then as well.
Well, absolutely. She's another great environmental warrior, and the understand. Look, indigenous people have had a different view of nature. They weren't Eurocentric about conquering nature. We don't want to glamorize it either, but they had a much better approach to living in harmony with the natural world, really only in the 1960s were people starting to give that some consideration. The Beat generation writers and poets started to, Gary Snyder and Kerouac and some of those guys. But really it was out of AIM, the American Indian movement, once they took over Alcatraz Island, were starting to put these sort of environmental rights documents out there, and we started getting Pulitzer Prize winning Native American poets and novelists, and it's grown, and now we're in the point where all of us are learning from Native people. And not just Native people. I just was 2 weeks ago with Ford Motor is celebrating George Washington Carver. And Carver was known as the Peanut and all this. At the end of he spent World War II up with Henry Ford in Detroit, and they were working on, they were all about regenerative farming as it's called today. And Ford now has created a Rachel Carson, George Washington Carver Institute on regenerative farming. This is an auto company moving in and their foundations into that space. But you said the best, smartest thing, I couldn't agree with you more, in that it's about movements, and that's what I've been looking at. And I do think the TR period was the first wave, FDR was the second. This long 60s, as we call it, 1960 to 73 was the third. But now it's global with climate. It's not about a person. It's not Al Gore's going to save the world. And it's growing up in a different grassroots kind of way. And I think the important thing is to get people involved. I tell a student that says they like the natural world, they might like the environment, join a little group. Join the local Audubon group, or join a local, get involved somewhere, so when the big moment comes, there are people already there communicating. And I think we're this summer may have been the tipping point when the world broke all of its heat temperatures.
Yeah, exactly. And now, there are some people in history, women and men, who, Edward Abbey, I don't know how many of you know who he was. He wrote Desert Solitaire and some real classics. If you haven't read him, look him up. And he wrote Monkey Wrench Gang as well. And he really influenced, he didn't show up at many hearings, but his writings influenced a whole wave of public land activists. And he had quite an influence in an underground sort of way. Then very visible and on the ground is Greta Thunberg. And we know what she has done and influenced so many movements, and particularly the youth as well. and a young woman, and she now has sort of stepped back and said, there are so many others who can take this on, and so she has backed down a little bit. But my last question goes back to Kennedy and relates to the climate movement. He was able, his moonshot, going to the moon, he not only catalyzed that, but he actually mastered pulling together politicians, or the politics, the culture, the science, and the need. And that's leadership. And where is that leadership now? Why can't we find that in the in the climate movement?
Good way, I think, for us to end with that. Kennedy did know about climate. He believed, you know, scientists were Time Magazine's Person of the Year in 1960. There was this belief in science. We don't have that now. That's a great tragedy in so many ways. That the climate activists have to fight climate denying is just ludicrous. Johnson knew about climate. One of the most startling documents I saw, I used in my book, Silent Spring Revolution. Some of you might remember Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Nixon brought him into the White House. He was a Democrat, and there's a letter he writes to John Ehrlichman to give Nixon all about climate in detail, and then says, if this looks like it's true, the CO2 emissions, he writes, that means goodbye Miami, goodbye New York. What happens to Seattle is uncertain. For a scholar, when you look at papers, to see that from 1969, you know, circulating in the White House it's revelatory. All of our presidents are trying to do something, but it's never enough. And I think as long as we're divided like we are on the partisan divide, you're going to see a lot more state activity in the, meaning what Gavin Newsom's trying to do in California. You're going to finding ways to not sell fossil fuel vehicles by 2030 or not allow. That I think you're going to see a state taking leadership, because the auto industries, not only are they trying to go electric, they're not that tied as we used to think to the oil and gas world. They're willing to go different things if they can make money on alternatives. But in order to pull that off, you'd really have to have a swatch of the country, something as big as California, Washington, and Oregon, leading a way where other states join. But I see a day like that coming, and meanwhile, we got to get rid of coal. And China's not, and it's a problem, but we can keep working to figure out how we can finally retire coal, which has built our country, but it's not the energy source we need for the 21st century.
Well, America doesn't even have an energy plan, and neither does the world. So without a plan, it's pretty hard to reach the goal. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And your
so
brain needs to be, when you pass, preserved in formaldehyde, because you remember so much. Please give this gentleman a big hand.
Thank you. Thank you.